Amrita.
Bhakti, can a woman really travel alone?
Yeah, of course. If the driver can get the car ready.
Spoken like a true upscale Indian, Bhakti. Tell me, did you really have this life?
Of course not. I did not have this life. I'm far too middle class. So, in the few instances that I traveled alone, it was very anxious and complicated experience. And of course, our question is, can a woman really travel alone? And we can answer it many ways. But the truth is, of course, a woman can travel alone and she should exercise the right to travel alone and see the world. But I think the question we are really asking is, what do we do when the world is designed to make this kind of travel extremely difficult, dangerous, sometimes even deadly for women, right?
I agree with you 100%. And, I'm thinking, as you mentioned, the world is designed for men in all kinds of public spaces, right? But I also want to go back to the question itself, how we are defining travel. Is it an extended journey? Is it an overnight journey that we
Hmm.
are talking about here? Long journeys for multiple
Right,
reasons.
right.
I'm thinking of the different levels here. So, from the educated person, an elite who wants to see the world, to the working woman who has to travel for work, has the privileges, to also migrant labor women who have to make really very, very insane calculations when they move away from their homes for work.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, I guess the way I was thinking about it, of course, is that we're not talking about like the commute, right? The daily commute, because I
Right.
think that's a whole different episode in itself. I mean,
I
commuting,
agree.
what
Yeah.
what hell on earth that can be. But yeah, I of course, we can only come at it as privileged, educated women who have traveled for work and also have traveled for pleasure
For-
and have the money to do that.
Right.
But yeah, I feel that the world is so, you know, the design of it all is so masculine
Hmm.
that I always feel bad, especially for the migrant women, as you're talking about, or the labor force, women in the labor force who leave, their potentially other towns, other villages, and move to take on these long term jobs, whether it's
Hmm.
domestics or, uh, jobs like that are often designed for women, childcare, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So, and then when they have to leave their home, they have to then take overnight buses, overnight trains, sometimes flights, and there's a whole set of regimes that comes about. But I think, so I think we're first of all getting to the question of class, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Travel
I
and class are intricately linked.
completely agree with you. And you were mentioning the migrant women. I was just thinking what happened during the pandemic. Do you remember, of course, there's lockdowns, and then there are these migrant women, of course, men too, who are stranded. There are no resources for them to travel back from the urban metropolitan cities back to their home spaces and cities. And so it's an erasure of a kind. So we are coming back to it from
Yeah,
a class point of view. It
absolutely.
is easier. There are, despite there are incredible logistical differences and difficulties that we must talk about when women of a certain class also travel, right? It's not
Yeah,
completely romanticized like usually it is on social media.
I
Women
know.
of certain classes also go through all these
Absolutely.
difficulties.
Absolutely. And the first, like, let's even just break down like what you're carrying in your bag or what you're wearing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we're going to have an amazing guest today, Suchitra Vijayan, who traveled 9,000 miles across India's border. I mean, she did it in short spells or long spells, rather, over a 7 year period. But she still went and did this. And we should ask her whether she was carrying, like, chili powder or like a little knife, or whether she was,
Right.
packing any weapons,
Yeah.
and what she wore. What do you think about that? Like, what, you know, Do you feel that we, unfortunately, unlike men, we have to start with that primary calculation of how we carry our
Absolutely.
body?
I think that is one of the most primary thoughts that enter our minds. I think you would agree with me, Bhakti, when we are entering any kind of public domain and public sphere, it is a constant negotiation about how I'm presenting myself, what clothes I'm wearing, um, what time. I mean, there's this construct about, an odd hour to go out. I was thinking about this the other day that, who considers what is an odd hour to go out for women? Because,
I know.
even a time is constructed in a very specifically patriarchal gaze, right?
Yeah.
So, and on top of that, I know no woman who has not looked around where the car is parked, where how far spaces are to walk to in a certain hour, what clothes, as you mentioned, we are wearing, the way we are perceived in public spaces. So this is all of a different kind of uh, a logistic that is embedded within us as we travel.
And the unsaid thing here that we can both say is that it's constantly about safety. And safety from what? Sexual
Yeah.
assault, rape, all these horrific things that do happen. It's funny, in preparation for this episode, I started to read a lot of these crazy blogs about women traveling across India.
Hmm.
And it was very funny because, first of all, a lot of them were written, of course, by white European or American women. And there is this whole kind of extra layer of claiming how India is particularly unsafe and there are all these issues. And I just, I wonder, I mean, do you think that, we have both had the privilege, of course, to travel through India, through other countries that are developing countries or non, European, non-Western countries. Do you
Hmm.
think that it's easy to travel um, elsewhere, but that India is particularly tough? I want to get to the bottom of this.
It's a tough question, Bhakti, because I traveled when I was really young. I don't know what my parents were thinking. We did not have cell phones at that time, so I'm ancient. But my parents, during my first year of college, sent me from Delhi to Kanpur on a train to meet a cousin of mine, and I was very, very aware of being alone and how I needed to be in my bodily experience travel for the first time. That was my first travel experience alone in India. But I don't completely agree that we can simplify this as an India as an unsafe space and the rest of the world being, especially the West being a safer space for women to travel. I'm thinking about this particular book by Jamie Attenberg called I Came All This Way to Meet You. And it's a harrowing read about how Attenberg talks about disguising herself, putting on a hat and very asexual clothes, going about in Europe on night trains where she would be constantly aware of a certain kind of gaze and problems and molestations or
Yeah.
potential dangers of those kinds of experiences. So not at all. I think, women go through certain kinds of problems, similar problems everywhere.
Absolutely. I think, like, I'm not trying to come out on the other side of this conversation at all, but I have to say that the question of sanitary spaces sometimes is a problem.
Wow.
I think
Yes.
spaces are obviously always designed, in a masculine way, and you cannot get away from certain gazes, whichever part of the world you are in. But one of the things in India, even to this day when I travel, the pit stops like the
Mm,
dabas or even like the toilet stops can often be unsanitary in various
mm,
ways. And that's not just India. I mean, there are many countries who have issues around hygiene and sanitation. And that's
mm,
particularly impacts, you know, women, if they
mm.
are going through something, if it's that time of the month and things like that, it's super tough. So I would say that, I think we as a country, as Indians, get very low points in this
Mm,
particular department. But I know that it's changing. and one
Mm,
can only hope that it kind of gets better and better.
mm,
But you know, one of the reasons I was thinking about this also is there is such an uptick in the amount of women traveling, Indian women traveling,
mm.
South Asian women traveling, brown women traveling through India and elsewhere. And you know, we are, the last few years we have seen a whole influx of Bollywood movies
Yeah.
and you know, all kinds of like interesting things that create this desire, right, that make
Mm.
it seem alluring, adventurous, exciting. I don't know. uh, I think this is true, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, all of the films coming from Dilwale Dulhania to, women traveling together. Recently, I'm thinking about Veere the Wedding, and all these kinds of messages about women traveling are so romanticized and valorized in a certain way that it
Hmm.
almost erases the kinds of things that we're talking about. The lack of sanitation or hygienic spaces for women to access really tells us about how public spaces are not even functional for women, right? And I'm thinking again of a really interesting book narrative, and this is a memoir by Sonora Jha, How to Raise a Feminist Son, where she talks about her experiences of being a journalist, albeit in the past, but where she talks about being in Allahabad, and it was 106 degrees, and this is a harrowing, haunting story where she literally had to shower, and there is no space for a woman to shower, whereas all these little enclosures are made for men, which covers the entire body but not the face. So who's showering in these enclosures is easily discernible as a man. And she had to go through one of those episodes of having to take a shower where she was almost having a heat stroke, and to the utter horror. And there was this line I keep remembering: "I never wanted to leave my home again," she says in that book.
Oh
So
gosh.
it can be traumatic even, and we forget that. I mean, the fear and the safety, but the mental trauma that it can cause to many women.
Yeah, yeah, wow. Okay, yeah, that's intense. I mean, I'm thinking also of a book that became a movie that became so popular that it just became its own phenomena. I don't know if you ever watched Eat, Pray, Love.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
and Eat, Pray, Love was crazy because she goes to Indonesia, to India, and to Italy. And it became such a thing that you go, you seek your peace, you go on this travel journey to realize something about yourself. And then I still remember that so many women went on to then take the same journey, you know, to those same places, because the idea was they would have the same experience as the author of the book, Elizabeth Gilbert.
Right.
And it's just crazy because we are trapped in a way between this desires that the media generates. And I mean,
Yeah.
we can ask Suchitra about that too, but between these desires that the media generates and then the actual reality, and within that, let me throw in another loop, right, which is
Yeah.
traveling while brown, if we can say that. And I'm
Really
inspired, of
important.
course. Yeah, I'm inspired here by a book by a Kenyan journalist and writer, Nanjala Nyabola, who wrote something called Traveling While Black. And
Mm,
I think, let's get it out straight out right. Black women have the worst experience
mm,
traveling anywhere in the world. In India, the extraordinary levels of racism that Black people and women encounter, it's out of control. Okay, so
absolutely.
I am not trying to say it's the same thing, but
No.
there is something like traveling as out there in the world. If we are thinking about, is it tougher in India, tougher in the West, but
Mm.
being Indian, being brown, and traveling in those Western European spaces is also has its challenges.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm thinking, as a woman of color traveling, it is a certain kind of negotiation with the racialized gaze, absolutely. But also when it comes to crossing of borders, I mean, I would love to hear what Suchitra has to say. But as a woman of color, there are these larger obstacles of visa regimes, right? I mean, traveling with an Indian passport, how many times do you have to be stopped because it's not the right passport? Whereas
I know.
another woman perhaps has it easier with a passport from the global north. And you
Mhm.
and I both know with how it was like before with an Indian passport and when our passports changed.
I know. And it's also the illegitimacy sometimes that the West creates when they
Mm,
see a brown woman, a non-white woman walk through the door. And I know I've been taken for a maid or a cleaner or a domestic person, and nothing against maids or cleaners, but come on, you know what I mean?
yeah,
It's the
yeah.
idea is that even my good credit card is somehow not valued, right? And
Mm,
there's a baseline racism sometimes that's at
absolutely.
play that interacts with a baseline sexism,
Mm,
which means that one is often demeaned or have to justify themselves in certain situations, and then the other aspect of that is either you have to justify and you're experiencing this racism sexism, or the other type of thing where you're being saved, like, can we help
yeah,
you, are you lost?
that's so true.
You
Yes.
don't seem like someone
Yeah.
who's empowered enough to go out there and travel. So it's a
or
weird.
or even or belong to that space, right? So many times I have been in this Swedish countryside or spaces in Scandinavia where I would perpetually be the foreigner. And
Mhm.
even after 6 years of living here, I will always be the foreigner who needs some kind of direction, some kind of help. So it's very interesting how visibility is a marker of not belonging in some ways for a woman too, right?
Right.
Bhakti, did you have a story where you felt unsafe though, or within India or outside India, where it really told you about these kind of specific problems that we're talking about?
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of times in India, I used to take these overnight buses to Goa. I've taken buses from Delhi to, Dharamshala, to Manali, like all this kind of fun stuff one did at that time. And there's a constant, when the bus goes dark at night, you know
Mm.
it's not sexy fun at all, you know what I mean, as you would see in a Bollywood or a rom-com movie. But it is a bit, it's hard because you exist in a stress that I shouldn't fall fully asleep, I shouldn't give in entirely to sleep. What may happen, I don't know. And
Mm.
I'll be honest, I feel this way on, like, planes as well sometimes.
Agree.
It's like, if you feel that the person sitting next to you don't feel totally comfortable, you feel a
Yeah.
bit odd. um
And
you know
that's an entitlement of spaces also we have to think about when traveling as women, right? That,
yeah.
a person sitting next to you inhabiting a really sort of
Hmm.
a space that borderline crashes into yours. Those are things that we never really think at all, and yet we have to experience and then quickly come up with ways to being
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
those spaces.
Yeah, and my comfortable place is, of course, my research has been a lot on war and conflicts. So I have been to places which are post-war, where something
Mm,
has occurred, and there is a kind of political tension. I have also been to places which are hardcore dictatorships, and there are a lot of rules that are at play.
mm,
So in those situations, you're very tense, even if you're supported institutionally. Even if you know that there is a conference organizer you can go to, or a fixer who helps journalists, and so on and so forth. So fear is like is fundamental.
yeah,
And it sucks because travel can be so exhilarating,
yeah,
so exciting, and you learn so much, but there is so much overcoming one has to do individually,
yeah.
that it almost sometimes it's like, is it even worth it?
I completely agree with you. And when you're talking about fear and conferences, I quickly remembered an anecdote. This was pre-pandemic. Me and my co-writer, we eventually came out with the book later on, not on the same subject. It was on a very academic topic of Rabindranath Tagore and W.B. Yeats. But she and I traveled for an academic conference to Colorado, and we had an Airbnb. So it was not even traveling alone as women, we were together. And yet, when we reached there, it was past midnight, and the bedroom window, I still remember hauntingly, was very close to the street, and there were a group of men laughing and drinking constantly at that window. And we were so terrified. And we, at that late hour in the night, these early career researchers called our chair at that time, who was a wonderful woman, and said, "Get thee to a hotel right now." I remember that. So, the fear is not unreal. It is extremely real in how we have to inhabit public spaces.
Right. Well, let's welcome our brilliant Suchitra Vijayan into the studio because she literally conquered all these fears, or we're going to find out if she was afraid the whole time or not. But hi, Suchitra. Welcome to the studio.
Hi, Suchitra.
Hey, Amrita.
Welcome. You're a journalist and photographer, and you've written an amazing book, Midnight's Borders: A People's History of Modern India. So let's start here. This book is described as an epic 9,000-mile journey along India's many contested borders over a period of 7 years.
Wow.
Tell us a little about your impetus to begin this long and complex journey alone. Where did this idea come from?
I mean, the idea was, I think now in the distance of almost a decade, I feel like I have a better sense of where this idea came from. But I think I had just come back from, I'd spent about 18 months in Afghanistan. I had spent time in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And while I got there initially as a researcher, it became very clear that there are certain kinds of stories were possible, or the stories that I was finding or encountering in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border were stories that not only had to be told, but they made the possibility of having conversation about this war in a more nuanced way. There was no good or bad. There was no black and white. Everything was murky. And in that murkiness, we still had to find a sense of humanity of the people in Afghanistan. And when I came back, I just felt this deep sense of, I felt anxious, I felt uneasy. I just really felt that there was something here as a form, as something intellectually exciting for a writer to explore. And then over a conversation, just simply I said, oh, what would it be like if I actually traveled the breadth of India's borders, and what would I find? And that was it. Not that it was any grand idea or strategy or anything like that. I remember telling about the idea to Bhakti when I first met her. Bhakti then was very pregnant.
Oh my
And
gosh. And you were pregnant with ideas, Suchitra.
and I think at that moment, if I think Bhakti was one of the first people that I spoke to about this book. And if she had said something like, oh, what a stupid idea, or I think I would have perhaps shut it down. And she said, oh, that's really great. So what are you going to do with it? Like, she was actually curious about the ways in which I was going to do about it. I don't know if Bhakti remembers it. But it definitely was one of those things where I felt that also I was much younger, and I was still not, while maybe I was confident up front, but maybe I was still struggling to understand what the methodology would look like, what a travel would look like. But the idea that others seemed curious and fascinated about the idea was also another impetus. And I think the third thing was that maybe it was also an escape, right? I think a great adventure is always also an escape from the things that you were trying to resolve, or, and I think for me, I was in a moment where I had taken time off. I had just finished graduate school. Either I could go get a 9 to 5 job, or I could go do other things. The idea of a 9 to 5 job seemed
Yeah.
not something that I wanted. But I think
Yeah.
at the heart of it was just the curiosity of what would one find.
Yeah. And then, I love the idea. When I heard it, I was amazed that you were going to take this journey upon yourself, and so Amrita and I are coming off of a heated conversation, whether solo traveling as a woman, it's not the solo part. The emphasis here really on the woman part.
Agree.
is tough, and it's very much a world designed for men. Travel writing is also designed for men, and there are so many challenges. And I know you had been to Afghanistan. I know you had been to various parts of Africa. I know you had spent time in, of course, in Europe and places like that. I mean, let's kind of talk a little bit about the challenges of specifically traveling in India as a woman, or even as a group of women or a duo of women. And Amrita and I also touched a little bit upon questions of class, access to drivers,
Mhm.
decent hotels. What did you find was the biggest issue or a grand challenge in this?
Bhakti, I think to answer this question, I have to go a little, uh, at least a few years back. Um, I think the first time I traveled purely to write was the India book, which became the Midnight Spotters. Every other travel I had done as in relationship to something else. I was either an undergraduate living in Leuven and I was like taking buses across Europe, or I had just gotten a job with the UN and I was in these places, whether it was Hague or Arusha or even in Cairo. I was working
You were part
and
of a system,
I
you're
was
saying.
part of a system, and then the travel then was a way for me to find out. Um, and then that is very different than when you become those. You are both the institution, the person, the writer, the lighting person, you're the football. They're two very different aspects. Um, when I was traveling predominantly in Europe and other places, I still had an Indian passport. I still looked like this, which meant that I didn't look like the average person who was traveling. Eat, Pray, Love still had a huge hold when I was traveling in 2000s. I was often the only, while the Dilwale Dulhania Le Jayenge had kind of normalized the idea of a group of brown people traveling together as a group.
I
Coming,
just have to step in here and tell our listeners that Suchitra does not look like Julia Roberts nor like Kajol. So, we're talking already about a set of challenges here. Go
uh,
on.
so I think that was always there. But I also had, but also how many Indian kids in early 2000s were undergraduates studying in England who had still an Indian passport. Yes, I had an Indian passport, but I still had the resources to travel. So it's a little bit more complicated than, oh, you're just a brown or black person traveling. And also we have to understand that black and brown people traveled in different ways. Black
Mm.
and brown people with access to resources, English language, or any European language travel very differently than those who get on a boat or those who get on a truck to cross borders. So that is one thing. Now, India is very complex because, again, I was traveling in a part of India that was very alien to me. I was born and raised in Madras, which meant that language was an issue. And I think it's very important for people to remember that no travel in contentious places ever happens alone. You're always with a community that opens up their homes, that takes you with them. I spent more time in people's homes, um, than in hotel rooms. Yes, hotel rooms happened, but there's only so much you can spend on hotel rooms. When I was doing this book, I didn't have a job, I didn't have a fellowship, which meant that I would have to kind of make money, raise money, go do the book, come back. Um, so first thing is, when I was traveling to write this book, I was never alone. Yes, I the idea was mine and I traveled, but every time you go to a community to write about them, the community's willingness to open their homes and the willingness to be with you along the way is an important part of writing a book. So I wasn't really alone. Especially in Kashmir, it became very clear that without them, the community kind of knowing what happened. For example, I would be told, hey, why don't you leave tomorrow? Maybe you've done here for, it's not like, oh my God, something is wrong, you have to leave. It'll be like, oh, you've been here for 2 or 3 days. Why don't we kind of take you and, drop you off? And why don't you? So, in that sense, that it was very important that the community itself knew what was coming. Uh, so, yes, I think we really have to, we can't make generalizations. In some places, someone who looks like me could get, for example, in BSF camps, most of the BSF officers had two reactions. One, they would say, go away, get permission from Delhi and come back, or the biggest regional office nearby and come back. Or in other cases, they were just very curious about this young woman who was traveling, that they really just wanted to invite you in. I was less threatening. So that helped.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
Other places, being able to speak in English helped in other places, because then it becomes a marker of class and caste in some ways.
Mm.
In other places, being Tamil helped, because a lot of, and being both Tamil and Telugu helped, because a lot of the BSF security border guards were either from Tamil Nadu or Andhra. So for them, meeting someone, um, so who you are both can open up doors and also shut them in your face. And like all things India, the world changes every 100 feet, and you really need to navigate your identity every time you travel. um, what is once hospitable and generous, 100 feet down the road could be something completely different.
So, Chitra, I wanted to jump in and think about all the really fascinating frames that you just spoke about in terms of people's homes opened up to you and traveling with an Indian passport, what that means in terms of, we were talking about, me and Bhakti talking about visa control and the border regimes that come up with it. Um, and also traveling as a brown person, as a woman of color that constantly undergoes a certain kind of racialized gaze. So you spoke about curiosity that really embarked you on this journey. Could you tell me then what made it all worth it in the end?
uh I don't know. Some days I wake up and I think it didn't. Both of you have been privy to some of my, these doubts that I've had for a very long time. Um, there was a point when I felt that I had actually wasted a lot of time in nothing. There was a time when COVID had happened. We were living in our one bedroom apartment with our young daughter. The book hadn't come out. My husband's startup had moved into our one bedroom apartment. And those things were frustrating, because I think our own perceptions of what is worthy and not worthy changes quite a bit. Now it feels like I can walk away saying that I did something. I came up with an idea, I persevered, I executed it. It kind of taught me things that I don't think, it was like going to school for it was like going to school for life lessons, but the life lesson was me. I had to figure out things I was good at, what I was not good at. So in that sense, yes, it was very, um it was worth it. But then I also had my daughter in 2016, and then um the way I travel just changed. My body changed. I don't know if there was a point between the ages of 17 and 32. I just had the capacity to travel anywhere and everywhere, given the limitations of my passport. I don't think I can take off to Afghanistan for 18 months anymore. I don't think I can go to Syria anymore. I don't think I can. When I'm thinking about my new book, which also kind of involves a lot of travel, my first response is, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
Right. Right.
I can't even take up fellowships anymore, because there's no way. The cost of doing a fellowship would be more than the cost of uprooting my family and moving, right? So motherhood and travel kind of becomes impossible. The cost
Right.
of travel becomes, so I don't know. I really don't know if it was what it means.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, motherhood and travel comes with its special brand of running around with, from diapers to the snack packs, to the, to the whatever. But to return to this idea, like when you traveled as a journalist. Do you want to say a bit more about some of the precautions you took? Like, I'm sure your mindset at that time was completely different. What did you, for example, decide you must wear? or there's all these, Amrita and I were looking at all these blogs and crazy travel writing, and they, the kind of weapons, from chili powder to little knives to safety pins to whatever that people carry. And this is not just India, it's just anywhere really, you want to be safe. Pepper sprays. So what were some of the precautions you took? What did you look like at the time that I could immediately say, okay, she's on this mission and she is armed with X, Y, and Z items? Give some tips to future young women who are taking this on, because there's a big uptick now in this culture.
Um, I think I think, like, as I said, traveling as a journalist or writer was very different than traveling otherwise. I think one of the things that I do, and I've always done for a very long time in India, is that in India, I'm always wearing cotton and I'm always wearing either full hand kurtas, or I usually just wear very baggy clothes. I don't know when that happened. Um, I think India also changed because I grew up in Madras where it didn't feel so, as a woman, you didn't feel so objectified. Now, even in a place like Madras, walking down the street, I feel the need to wear baggy clothes, right? So something in India changed. And I think I could feel that when I started traveling in 2012, 2013 in India. And by the time I finished my travel, the last of the travel happened in 2019. India itself had changed. Like when I was first started traveling, I really didn't, I was also very stupid. I was also in my 20s and very stupid, that I really didn't think about precautions. The things that I did do was that I made sure that I had done my research. There's always somebody in the community that I would go, who I trusted, who was a friend of a friend or somebody that I knew.
Right.
And one thing I had developed years of traveling in, whether it was Afghanistan or other places, was a sense of this kind of the sixth sense that one has about, situational awareness, about terrain analysis. That is something I felt I just honed, because when I left home at 17, my my parents literally just put me on a flight and sent me off. This now feels like I know that today grad students get dropped off by parents, right? So the great gift my parents gave me was, fine, go do this, and I had to do everything. So that kind of gave me a sense of um, analysis of I could take care of myself. I had done this. I had moved multiple times, multiple homes, between the ages of 17 and when I was going to do this. That helped. Um, but towards the end, I think this kind of started happening around 2017, 18. For the first time, when I would go into communities, people started asking, I look like this, which means I would usually, my hair would be tied back. I would wear something baggy. There are no physical markers of caste, color, religion. I'm dark skinned, which also means that it kind of throws people off in terms of they can't quite place you in terms of the hierarchy. For the first time, I started seeing people ask questions like, what caste are you? What religion are you? And often when I would travel with somebody whose identity could get them in harm's way, those are things that I had to navigate, which felt a little scary. The fact that I could speak English, I could kind of demand that something was there. And I could see how caste and class then kind of place into it. You just automatically, because you are socialized with access to resources, you believe that the state is there to help you. Your demeanor changes. You actually say, how dare you? I need to, like, so those things I felt um, very much are things that we are socialized into. Um, but the tricks, and like, I never carried chili powder with me. I never did any of that. But I did. I remember that when I was embedding in Afghanistan, I had learned firearm training. I know how to, like, I know the basic things of defending myself. I can do arm to arm combat, but these are things I learned. But I don't know if I learned arm to arm combat, but I don't know if somebody attacks me, if my, you know, in the sense that physically I had kind of trained myself, but I really didn't carry any of these things with me, which maybe in retrospect, one should.
Oh gosh, really? No, but that means you didn't. Maybe you had the privilege to have not been unsafe. That you prepared enough. That you weren't in that way.
As I said, like I
But
did a lot of groundwork, right? Like thing is that
Yeah.
every time I
mm,
went in, I know I was going to go meet someone I knew who was from the
Hmm.
community,
Yeah.
somebody or somebody new, which itself is an immense privilege. And that's why when I started, I
mm,
said a book like this could not have been written alone. I wasn't traveling alone. There were
mm,
communities that took care of me, that protected me, that opened doors for me, that looked out for me. Um, and I
Yeah.
think that's a very different way of traveling than, parachuting into this wanderlust of this. I didn't parachute into any place. There was an existing relationship there that was built,
Yeah.
or somebody who already had those relationships was generous enough to open it for me. So I didn't parachute into a place like Indiana Jones. I didn't do that.
Sure.
but
Look,
I
look, very quickly, Amrita, I just want to follow up on this. I just want to push back slightly on this idea, Suchitra, that, you took all the precautions, you didn't parachute, you prepared, you found friends of friends. But I just want to put it out there that things can still go very wrong. It
Absolutely.
didn't for you.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
I was going
Absolutely.
to
Sorry.
ask I was going to ask the same question actually, that you're right about the visible markers that as women we have, or even within India, uh, caste and class and religion can really offer some spaces opening up and completely shutting down in other contexts. But I really am interested that you did not prepare in terms of logistics, and no, you said you prepared for logistics but not having a fear, whereas I was thinking about almost all the time that we travel as women, there's a fear traveling with us, that what if, like Bhakti said, what if something goes wrong along the way? So was there at all something going along in your mind, especially when travel is such a very male dominated domain?
Hmm.
Um, Amrita, I just think that the fear that something might happen to you is so, it's embedded in all of us that it's psychologically just there, right?
Mm,
It's just there all the time. It's like this, it's this constant thing that's always running in the back of your mind that I think at some point in time, because the trauma of living with this fear is so much, I think we all just learn to survive with it, right?
mm,
It's not that I wasn't afraid. Of course I was afraid. It was not, I know things could go really, really bad. I think it's also quite telling that we've all taken this fear and learn to live with it to a point where we justify it, because otherwise it's paralyzing, right? It's
absolutely.
paralyzing. And that is, I mean, I'm not just saying this as someone who went and did traveling. I think this is just as a woman.
Yeah.
um I think maybe by the time you're 5 or 6, you become a sexual object. So now apparently much younger. You're
Ah.
constantly navigating a
Mm,
world where you're just a body, and anyone
Hmm.
could do anything to you. Sometimes the very people who gave birth to you can take the, can be the ones causing you harm. And then you go into the workplace, the life, the playground, every aspect of your life. As women, we learn to navigate and live with this fear.
mm,
So when I
Yeah.
don't talk about the fear, it doesn't mean that this fear didn't exist or I didn't plan for it or, oh my God, it was so. No, it was just that it was always there.
mm,
Hmm.
It's like we get up every morning and we brush our teeth. Like
Right.
we don't talk about
mm,
brushing our teeth as but it's so important, but it's just that it's there. But
mm,
Yeah.
um that is where we are. What can we
Yeah.
do? What can
It
we?
it reminds me of last in last year. So in 2022, I was in Sudan. I was mainly in Khartoum, doing some research, and today there is war there, and there is all kinds of issues. But at that time, it was a vibrant, beautiful, wonderful place, and it felt safe for the most part. There was one thing though, which is because that they had so many sanctions put on them by so many countries, the currency is extremely inflated. So at
mm.
any given point, even to pay for a cab or for any little thing, to buy a snack, you are carrying like bundles and bundles of cash, up to 1.5 kilos of cash in your purse.
Wow.
And I just got into the mood of it, and I was doing it, and I was doing it. But then, as I landed back in the US, I realized like my whole body had altered. Like I wasn't doing this like purse clutch that I had done
Mm.
for a solid 2 weeks that I was there. But it reminded me of this because you're right, like that fear kind of seeps into the body, and your body
Yeah.
is clenched in a particular way as you move through things. And then sometimes you realize, as I did in that moment, but sometimes you don't, so that's very
Mm.
interesting what you're saying. Go ahead, Amrita. I keep interrupting you.
There's also one part of the book where I think it's the only part of the book where I talk about it in any real sense, is that I just interviewed, this was in the Kaimangan district, remote Kaimangan district. I just interviewed this 80-year-old woman who, for the first time, was speaking to an outsider about this horrific rape that had happened to her as a young woman by the Indian Army.
Mm.
Gosh.
And the person who I was with, who was helping me translate, we were just stepping out, and they had just, because they're from the community, had just walked ahead a little before. And I had, as usual, just stepped out. I was taking a camera. I was with my camera, so I was taking photographs of the place outside. And then I just crossed into Burma. I just crossed into the other country,
Mm.
and all of a sudden I feel a hand in my back, and I turn around, and you see the Nasaka, which is the border security force, which is
Hmm.
just as brutal. And
Mm.
just 2 months ago in Calcutta, I had interviewed another Rohingya man who talked about what the Nasaka did to his village, of the brutality.
Hmm.
And that moment I knew that my it really felt, I went cold, and I didn't know. And then they were like, oh my god, what are you doing? And then I stayed. And then, you know that was one moment when anything could have happened to me, right? Anything could have
Mm.
just and that's the only thing that I put in. And this is again a conversation that me and Bhakti have been having, and she's kind of pushed back on this idea of how much of yourself can you put in the book,
Hmm.
Mm.
right? I just talked to a woman who, in her 80s, is now narrating a story of gruesome rape. And
Ah.
then it just felt so wrong to place my own experience of it right next to it, right? It felt
Of
Mm.
almost
course.
like equating, which is not what I was doing, but it's very easy for someone to kind of, at that moment, draw inferences which I was not meaning to. So I think as women, we also do not talk about these experiences because it feels that it's a distraction, right? A lot of women, even when they feel a lot of these things, don't talk about it because they say it. We use the word distraction. I don't want to be seen as a victim. I don't want this to be a distraction. I don't want to be known by what happened to me. So I think we definitely um, teach ourselves to perform a certain kind of
Yeah.
confidence when we travel. So it
Mm.
exists. It definitely exists. It's just that I think this was my way of saying, okay, I'm going to not
Yeah.
talk about it.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, yeah. Very
You,
important questions, but also to point out like that chili powder would not have worked in this situation. But go on,
so
Amrita.
true. So, you said something really interesting that as women writers, we also have to navigate how much of the self can be put in the writing and in the book. And I find that a really big and important question because, coming back to the writing of the book itself, Midnight's Borders, travel writing itself becomes a genre that has been dominated by men also, right? And I was reading somewhere that the genre where women traveling and writing about their experiences is considered more of a memoir, whereas men
Mm.
are doing the travel writing. And that is such a strange kind of dichotomy. And here you're also thinking about there are limits to putting the subjectivity of the woman in the book. So, how do you navigate first that how much of the experience you're going to narrate in the writing? And secondly, how do you think this is going to open up more for women writing travel experiences? Literally coming into the space of travel writing, not as a memoir.
No, I just think that I read a lot of men traveling and writing, when I was putting the proposal for this book, and I found almost all of them to be deeply um,
Skeptical.
not skeptical. I don't even want to call it problematic. I don't even think it was just mediocre.
Hmm.
It was mediocre, right? And what I found really perplexing was the very act of, say, a person going to a place, observing, and doesn't make them a good, it first doesn't make them a reliable narrator. It definitely doesn't make them an analyst. And finally, it doesn't make them an historian or an
Mm.
anthropologist. And yet, the very act of a man being in a space, we endo upon them so much power to describe,
Absolutely.
articulate, and define the contours of engagement. And I just really didn't want to be that person. Um, and I think because I knew what I didn't want to write, I was able to go and decide what is it that I did want to write, which was that I say this in the introduction of my book, is that I really didn't want to bear witness. I was really just doing a
Mm-hmm.
certain kind of an anthropology of the state in which I am critiquing the structures of the state. The
Hmm.
stories are not meant to give people a voice, or, as I said, the people who the communities that suffer are often eloquent voices of their own history and the histories of violence and the histories of resistance. My job then was to be a critique of the structures of oppression put in place by the state or by whatever existing systems that was in place, right? I think that I was very clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I didn't want to claim any kind of expertise, the genre of I went to cover a war, my personal life was falling apart, I still did it, and this is why, because I did it, I become the authority on this, is such a terrible way of seeing the world and writing about the world
Absolutely.
that, again, in my book, I really didn't also want to tell people what they were doing wrong. I didn't care
Mm.
about that. When I
Hmm.
was younger, I
Hmm.
did. I also wanted to point out and say, you did this wrong, and this is so terrible.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And as I was growing older and I was also writing this book, and Bhakti has seen this book through multiple book proposals, I just stopped critiquing what others were doing. And I just said, I know what I don't want to do, and let me try and see if I can create an alternative way of writing or set. I know it's imperfect, right? But,
Hmm.
and that really helped open up doors for me. It became productive for me to think about nonfiction and fiction. How does form work? How does form doesn't work?
Hmm.
um, I think that was a far more richer scholarship. And I'm not saying that we should not critique, it's just that I think we should try and open up spaces for those different kinds of writing. The
Mm-hmm.
second
Hmm.
question about women traveling is that I am going to be very pessimistic and say that given that resources and access to good writing and just who gets to write is still becoming smaller and smaller, we
Mm-hmm.
haven't
Hmm.
opened up the number of people who get to write. If you're going to see brown and black women travel and write, we are all going to be brown and black women who have access to English language, better passports. I mean, now I have an American passport, which just completely changes my relationship to travel.
Absolutely.
We're all
Yeah.
going to come from privilege of class and caste and resources. And that writing is one kind of writing, but that writing is never going to represent what really is happening, because someone
Hmm.
whose house is sinking is not going to get on a bus and go see the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? Someone whose house is burning down is not going to sit and think about the structure of a sentence that can describe how the fire is just, um,
Yeah.
that generation of the James Baldwins who walk the ground. Sadly, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. Just given where things are, I feel that the opportunity for that kind of powerful writing to emerge, we've structurally made it impossible. I'm not saying that the talent doesn't exist, it does. I think structurally we've made it impossible
Mm-hmm.
for that kind of writing to emerge.
Absolutely. And
Hmm.
along the way, a whole kind of factory of desire churns out these dreams for women, whether it's in romantic comedies or the eat, pray, love syndrome that, led
God.
to thousands of women going to those exact same places, wanting to have her journey, the same
Yeah.
journey. And then we see a big uptick also in Bollywood films that Amrita and I were talking about before. And
Mm.
we exist constantly in a weird lack of sync, right? The culture tells us it's cool to have destination weddings and take these youthful Dilwale Dulhania type of trips. And then on the other hand, you have these extraordinary visa regimes. And then, even if you succeed in having the privileges to go ahead and travel, we are then looking at a blank, all these challenges when it comes to wanting to publish that or write about it and so on. So it's very it's messy, it's very messy.
And also the fact that, sometimes, as Suchitra, you were saying, these are also journeys of catharsis for the person doing the travel experience into these very conflictual spaces, right? So it's all about a different kind of narrative coming along, which puts the person in focus in a very problematic space sometimes. But I was going to ask you something. You mentioned that you were in Calcutta doing that interview, and then soon later you crossed borders into Burma, and you obviously have crossed many other borders on the western side. Was it different from in crossing all of these different borders? How was the experience? It cannot be the same, I'm assuming.
No, it's just, as I said, I mean, the world really does change so quickly in these spaces that no one encounter is ever going to be the same. But having done this for 7 years, there does emerge a certain pattern. Um, the Bangladesh border definitely continues to be porous, which means that um,
Mm.
the porous nature of it, alongside a growing militarization, creates a very particular kind of navigation, right? So you could, if you look at my GPS travel images, I could literally just cross the border, right? I can literally trace the
Mm.
border and travel along it. That stops with the India-Bangla border. Uh, the moment you start making the turn up towards Kashmir and towards
Mm.
the India-Pakistan border, you can't even do that anymore because that becomes impossible. For instance, when I was in Kashmir, you couldn't really. I was based out of Srinagar, but you would go to Uri and come back. You would go to Baramulla and come back. There was because of the restrictions now, even more so, it was harder.
Mm.
With the India-Pakistan border, which is completely militarized and cleansed of
Mm.
people, again, the because the nature of these places are very different, the experiences are different. But by the time you go down to Gujarat side of it, it becomes marshy, and the relationship to land and water and desolation becomes, it changes. But the Gujarat chapter doesn't exist because that's one of the chapters that completely fell apart and people just didn't want to. I had interviewed a group of these fishermen community who were on who then became went on a strike because their livelihoods were being destroyed because of the militarization of the ocean. And along with it, you had stories of Pakistani men who had crossed across by mistake and were still stuck in India. But many of the people no longer wanted to be a part of this book, and that Gujarat chapter never made it. But that was just a very different relationship to the border. That was the ocean borders, just have a completely different, if I ever do um, another book, the ocean frontiers would be such a rich, it just completely changes your relationship to how you exist.
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and maybe that's why anthropology then becomes an incredible
Mm.
conduit, because then you just are looking, you're asking big questions of small places, and you can
Yes.
Yeah.
keep asking those questions for a long time.
Yeah.
But no, not everything was just so different. Every encounter was different, but again, as
Amazing.
I said, the patterns just change.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
It
And
is.
I'm so in awe, Suchitra, that you did this. And I want to introduce, we are running out of time. So I'm going to introduce another frontier. You were talking about the land, which is how you traveled, and then you spoke about the ocean as another frontier. But I just want to bring in another zone here, which is the zone of technology. We are all aware of armchair travel on our phones and on our computers, and there is so much. There's so much vicarious travel that happens, and you know what, the vicariousness I don't mind, but I still remember being struck by something I had read many years ago when Slumdog Millionaire, the film, came out, and everyone was criticizing it, for being poverty porn and this is problematic and so on and so forth. And I remember reading an interview with the original author of the book. His name is Vikas Swarup, and it was a shocking interview for me because he said he's a diplomat or something like that, and he had actually said, oh, he has never been to Dharavi. He kind of Google mapped all the locations when he was writing,
Wow.
writing the book. And then I don't know where do we, as a finale, where do we land on this? On the one hand, I'm thinking I don't want women to be unsafe. I don't want queer
Yeah.
people to be targeted and unsafe. But I also do want to know more, and that knowledge being produced and so on and so forth. Of course, the pandemic also taught us that we can literally do everything online, whatever the quality of that connection. Just a comment from you and Amrita on traveling online.
Amrita, you want to go first?
I don't know. I mean, given that the pandemic has actually created spaces, but it also makes it harder for women, I think, being in double sort of marginalized spaces of being in the house, then having to navigate the home pressures and do this kind of work. And this is an academic space that I inhabit, where there is teaching, there's every other thing that is going on in terms of online, may not be travel per se, but as a regular working life. And then women are cloistered sometimes within the home spaces. So I feel that I'm happy to be out and about, and yet these issues are there constantly about safety, about clothing, that I hadn't thought about how much of a game changer that is, as you were talking about these experiences of yours, Suchitra. But what do you think? Is it this or that? Can it be both?
No, I think for me, the first thing that really changed for me in terms of traveling online, and I think as a very early adopter of TikTok, um, no, I think when I started really consuming a lot of material on TikTok, which I did much before others got on
Mhm.
during the pandemic, I began to see a shift in how I was also seeing and narrating things. Even before we travel out, I think the rule that to be a good writer, you have to be a reader of everything. You read everything so that you understand. And I realized that my own relationship to gaze changed because of the way I was consuming TikTok so much, that
Mm.
my writing was changing. My long flowy sentences were becoming very, I hate this American kind of writing where Raymond Carver is considered the greatest writer and every sentence is like so crisp and like, which I and then kind of was, my sentences were changing, and then I realized that this was already affecting how
You.
I was writing, right? Forget
Mm.
even the travel. So even the way I was consuming this medium was affecting the way I was writing. And second, I think because we were also starting 2018-19, we were also collecting a lot of digital uh, videos circulated online of violence, whether it was India, also just looking at the police brutality violence videos that were coming to us, because we're also traveling then, right? We're also traveling with
Absolutely.
Mm.
that also kind of, I think, has already affected how we see space, how we describe the words we use, the way we think about ourselves. even now, I think we're all seeing ourselves reflected in this thing where that relation, this conversation in a studio would have been very different than this conversation now, right? I think those things are already changing stuff.
Mm,
I will talk about the good things that I really like is that when you see a drone footage of a space, it
Mm-hmm.
automatically
mm,
opens up the space in a way that the way you're able to see from top opens up a very different dimensions of storytelling than when you're on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I am excited by it simply because now we get to see another dimension as humans we never got to, right? We could now
mm,
actually lord over people, which is a very interesting looking down. Surveillance itself is a gaze,
mm.
and we're all surveilling objects. So that I find very interesting. Now, I am very conflicted about travel where you're not present on the ground simply because we're
Mm-hmm.
also fighting this moment where we do not know the difference between truth and reality. AI
Yes.
can now generate things that, there is this video of, I think, Brad Pitt talking
Yeah.
about something, and I thought it was real.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what is real anymore. I don't know.
I worry about the actual real people who get to travel and then what they're sending us. I worry about the
That's true
prism, the
too.
male centric or the white prism. That's also an issue, of course.
Yeah,
So,
and
Which
then
becomes normalized, right? That becomes the domain that we consume every day.
And
yeah,
also, I remember going to Greece for the first time, and I saw how everybody was trying to replicate the white dress in
oh
these same
God.
locations. And it doesn't look real because there are hundreds of people waiting in line to take the exact same flowy white dress in the
Hmm.
blue background. And then
Yeah,
I wonder, it's not real. I know
yeah,
it's not real. The hundreds of thousands of people who have taken these photographs that now populate Instagram know this is not real.
yeah.
So
And
what
yet
I
it
was
is hyper real, right?
right?
I
Um,
went to Namibia with friends, and I had one person who was a Instagram influencer. I love her. All good. I'm happy with anything anyone chooses to do. It's fine. But the issue here was simply that we were in the Namib desert, and my task was to throw sand at her face in a way that would just go, and then the photo is taken exactly as the sand goes all the way, a cloud of sand above her. And we did this like 10 times, and then it was just like, where is the irony, and she was like, oh, I'm sorry, I have to clean up now. But it's like, where is the irony? We are in a alternate universe at this point.
yeah.
Hey, Bhakti, I did not know that you knew an Instagram influencer.
Well,
There
Bhakti knows
has
a
to
lot of
be.
Instagram influencers.
Hey,
She's the
I'm very
OG.
connected.
She is the OG. OG. Yeah, she's the OG networker of the. No, she actually went to school with a lot of Bollywood actors and actresses, and she comes from that.
Yeah, no, i'm
Yeah,
i'm cool like that.
yeah, she's cool like that because also she doesn't name drop them. Like you're like, okay, who is this influencer that we're not supposed to? Yeah, it's all
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
Uh,
Thank you, Suchitra. This has
Thank
been
you.
amazing.
Thanks for
Thank you
having
so
me.
much. It was a fantastic conversation with you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
We'll be back on the wire next week with another question, another exciting guest, and more conversation.